We're going to cover the real estate FAQs for the 2024 buyer agency agreement. We are going to go over some of the questions that are most commonly asked. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into some of the aspects of the contract. And I'm sure you guys will have questions as well as I go through. So I'll leave enough time at the end for some Q&A. But just to recognize Martin Luther King, I love this quote: "Darkness cannot drive out of darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." And I think that's a great quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So in celebration of his life, we're going to have a lot of light today, a lot of knowledge that we're going to go over when it comes to real estate. So the question that I think some of the basic questions to get started is, where do I find these new forms and pamphlets? And is it the same process? The answer is, you can find the new forms on Transaction Desk. You can find the new forms on the Northwest MLS. You can find the new pamphlets on the Northwest MLS. And you can find everything also on our resource website, bestchoicerealtyhomes.com. And then the /downloads. And we have all of the new forms available for download there. So if you are using the express forms on Northwest MLS, you might have to discard. I still am seeing some of those law of agency things, and I'm still not used to the new forms of what the title is. It's not called the law of agency anymore. We're called Real Estate Broker in Washington pamphlet. And then there's also another pamphlet that's called the Important Information for Home Buyers. That is P1 and P7. So if you're looking to find them on the Northwest MLS, that's where you can download them. I went to the Northwest MLS. I did a little tour last week as a new board member, and it was funny because they still print these pamphlets, and they were frantically printing a lot of pamphlets and shipping them out to all the various companies that order them. So if you do want to get them nicely printed, the Northwest MLS still prints them. We still have them available in our office, and you can download them. It's only 4 pages now on the pamphlet, so it's not as big. And then the other important information, P7, is just a 1-sheeter. So is the process still the same for delivering these disclosures? The answer is yes. You still need to deliver these disclosures and have proof of delivery. The proof of the delivery, however, is not that receipt page that we used in the past. It's already in our buyer service agreement or our listing agreement. It's a checkbox. You just check it that I have delivered. So hopefully you've delivered the disclosures like you've done before. Most of you download them or have them available in your transaction desk, or your transaction coordinator sends them off. That would still be the same process for delivery of your disclosures. I would have P1 and P7 ready to go, along with P2, P3, and P4 and 5 if necessary. Those disclosures, just like normal, need to go out. We just don't want to see the old document floating around. Could you put it in the signing with the buyer service agreement? The answer is yes. I did that last week with the buyer I was working with. That still is okay to do, especially if you're working with vacant land. How else are you going to get all the paperwork done? You definitely can put it all in one signing. That's still good. But if you're wanting to obviously get it to the firm for delivery, you're going to probably want to disclose, put it in the subject line, the last name of your client, and then just put disclosures. And that way it will go right on into your file once we marry that up, once we match that up with your actual purchase and sale or your listing agreement. So if you can help me with that, that would be great. We still have 2 firm email addresses, support@bestchoicerealtywa.com and support@bestchoicerealtyid.com. Okay, so let's get that out of the way, basics. Then the big question, when should we introduce the buyer service agreement? So the law says before or as soon as reasonably practicable after providing brokerage services. And this is the part where everybody's having a little kind of like, when is this? What do they mean by this? I mean, let's interpret this a little bit more. So hopefully after today, you'll have some best practices, and we'll kind of discuss what the forms need to look like, so that we can make sure that we're adhering to the law. But an example would be, if you're doing an open house and you're having people come through the open house, we're not introducing the buyer service agreement with every buyer that comes through an open house. That's not practicable. It's not reasonable really to even think that that's even possible. And it really is not the type of message we want to send to our buyers. However, if that open house turns into an office appointment, or you're going to go out on some showings after the open house, and you're going to be introducing that buyer to more to some lenders and to some other properties, that would be the appropriate time to introduce a buyer service agreement. Another example would be an internet lead that wants to go look at a home. This internet lead happens to be, it's interesting because this did happen to us, that internet lead that came from Zillow that somebody paid advertising for was also a lead that was a sphere of influence lead in one of our buyers' Real Geeks accounts. And so two different buyer agents that potentially could put a buyer service agreement in front of that buyer. And again, our agent that got the internet lead did it right. Again, we need to warm up those internet leads. It's not appropriate to go and just say, I'm not going to go show you a home unless you sign this buyer service agreement. And so it's getting worked out right now. So again, when an internet lead wants to look at a home, you need to have more conversation, build a better relationship, understand their situation a bit more before you send them over a buyer service agreement for signature. So there's a bit more that goes in that's involved is before or as soon as reasonably practicable after providing brokerage services. So we'll go into that a little bit more. So this is a slide that Annie Fitzsimmons put together in her class. She wanted me to go ahead and reiterate this with all of you. That as soon as reasonably practical, reasonableness, standard use frequently determines, oops, now I'm going jumping around, there we go. The consideration of facts. So it's reasonable skill and care. I kind of use this as like common sense. I often say that to people. It's like, use your common sense. You know, does that make sense to actually put that agreement in front of that buyer at that point in time when you have not even understood, you know, are they ready? Are they willing? Are they able? Are they going forward and moving forward with that process? Or are you just going to be talking about the marketplace? That's different than if you were actually going to do some work on their behalf. The application is fact dependent. Brokers must understand that it needs to be done before they put a contract in place. And that's a new concept for many of our senior or brokers that have been doing this a long time. In our brokerage, it's not a new concept for our new agents. We actually train to use our buyer agency agreement even back in as early as 2017, 2018. We practice using that type of format. And it really is required before the buyer or broker you feel a little bit uncomfortable. I will say sometimes it's a little uncomfortable for those of us who have been doing this a long time. And that's to be understandable because of the way the law is written. Let's see. So here are some tips that I collected from a lot of you and also from some other brokers, top producers that I've spoken with recently. You must build a relationship first before you introduce. On the left side on the slide here is our first page of our buyer service agreement. It is a 4-page document, so it's quite lengthy. And then when you accompany that with the disclosures as well, that can be anywhere from 40 pages and then some. So it's quite a long process. So there's a lot of documentation or paperwork that you're going to put in front of that buyer. So it's better to have a relationship first with them. I had my first buyer that I put in a buyer service agreement after the holiday. It was January 1st. I'd already talked with this potential buyer. He got one of my holiday cards and he called me and said, yes, I'm going to be buying and selling a property in 2024. What do I need to know about? I've heard a lot about this agency law in Washington that's changed. So even though I have a relationship with this individual already, I still need to build more of a relationship, ask more questions, find out more about the story about what they want to sell and buy. I actually met him at one of my parties that I had around the holidays. So we kind of got, you know, but I obviously didn't break out the piece of paper and have him sign all of that on the New Year's Eve, you know, party. Not going to do that. That's not the way to build a relationship and introduce the buyer service agreement at that time. He actually, I thought this was a great idea. He actually said, you know, we talked about it, but then before I sent it to him for electronic signature, because he did say he wanted to go out and look at some properties. In order for me to prepare for that appointment, I wanted to make sure I had it in place. But he made a good point. He's like, you should probably train your agents that before you send it electronically, you may want to familiarize, you know, send it to them in a PDF ahead of time. That's okay to do. Some buyers may want time to actually read and review the document before you send it to them for e-signature. Definitely at a consultation, when you go and meet with that client and you're sitting down with them and educating them on the new laws and what to concern themselves with about the marketplace and maybe the homes you're going to tour. If it's in person and you're giving them disclosures and they want time to review it, you could always, or you're getting them to sign it and you don't have a copier right where you're at, maybe you're at a coffee shop, you're going to want to quickly take a picture and send them a copy, or when you get back to your home office that afternoon or evening, go ahead and send them a copy of what they signed. It's not enforceable if the person that signed does not have a copy of their signed agreement. You definitely want to do it before writing the offer, and you must have proof of delivery of those disclosures. So if you are, say you're sending those disclosures out before you engage in the buyer brokerage service agreement, you may want to make a date of that, of when you actually sent those disclosures to them, and then that receipt is embedded in the buyer broker service agreement. It says that you've given them those disclosures. I think the biggest tip to understand, and this is non-negotiable, you cannot get paid a buyer compensation without a buyer brokerage service agreement. It could be a non-exclusive, or it can be an exclusive, but I have to have something in the file sent to support in order for you to get paid a buyer compensation. Another top producer tip that we heard about last week was they use, this is the last page of our buyer agency, our buyer consultation package. It's in like a magazine format, or it's a downloadable on our resource website. This is the very last page, but one of our top producers uses this last page. In fact, they've just downloaded and printed a bunch of these, and they use this as like, kind of like the listing agreement. They have it open on their, in their Padfolio. They have the buyer service agreement already filled out, and they have how I work exclusively for you. On the other side, they have those pages open just like they would do a listing agreement, and they have it all ready to go, and they just kind of highlight what they're going to do on their behalf. And then they always get the agreement signed at that meeting, at that time when they're discussing the real estate services. So, and I thought it was clever, this particular individual, she actually discusses that compensation section in the buyer service agreement. And she talks about that our firm has a policy of having some sort of compensation described, whether it be a retainer or a consultation fee or a compensation. And the way she describes is that she basically says that the easiest way, and the way I like to work, is to have that compensation paid for by a seller. And if that does not work, it talks about how that would work with you. And that's how I will negotiate my compensation. And she says, I can certainly do a consultation fee or retainer, but I think that's the easiest way that we can work. How does that sound? And then she gets them to sign it. I thought that was really good. So while we talk about communication, because I will give you some scripts and some things to be careful about, we do need to talk about communication about compensation and price fixing. And you're going to see a couple samples that are still out there, and consumers that will want you to kind of fall into the trap of price fixing or antitrust laws. But as a reminder, price fixing is an agreement, written, verbal, or inferred from conduct among competitors to raise, lower, maintain, or stabilize prices or price levels. Generally, the antitrust laws require that each company establish prices and other competitive terms on its own without agreeing with the competitor. So you'll notice that I'm going to show you a few things on the screen today, and again, it's not meant to be price fixing or antitrust. So a couple teaching tools that Annie Fitzsimmons wanted me to make sure we cover with you. Again, she's the attorney for the Washington Association of Realtors, and she did, there's like an 80-page slide that I condensed for you guys today on the top things that I would take away from that presentation. Teaching good communication practices. So recognizing immediately and stopping or departing from conversations that have these types of words. So take notes of this. You may want to take a picture of this slide. When we use the word industry standard, I have to catch myself because I sometimes say that, or it's typical, or it's required, or it's normal, or what do you charge? Those are some buzzwords that maybe you're describing, and you've got to watch yourself on social media or on text messages or in chat rooms. I've seen a few people break the rules on some of these national MLS type of groups. These are closed groups, and so you got to be very careful on using those types of quotes that are in there. And how you text or how you email could be seen as price fixing or antitrust kind of issues that are out there. So there's some good. How should a listing broker talk to a seller about a buyer broker compensation? I get asked a lot when I'm a listing agent. I want to say, and this is the thing I've got to train myself not to say, was no broker is going to sell your home if you offer a compensation less than whatever it is. So I purposely have taken that out of the slide and made sure we didn't have any slides that reflect that. But we should not be talking about that. And I can't be posting these types of videos on YouTube that have this type of language for fear that we could have problems with our competitors taking that and using that against us. So instead, what you should say is you may offer no compensation to a buyer broker, or if you want to offer compensation, you may offer any amount you choose. And luckily, Best Choice Realty has the name Best Choice. So you can say, you know what, it's your choice on what you want to pay that buyer. But here's why you might want to offer a buyer broker compensation this amount. And you can explain to them a little bit more on the why so that they can ultimately make that decision on how they compensate that buyer. If you compensate the buyer more, you will get more showings. We know that from historical facts that we have brought to the table, and listings that may be offered this or that will have more competition. In fact, you can share an example. I had a seller that offered 0.5% more than what see, and then again, you can't say typical. See, you get caught in these types of things. So you want to be careful, and you really choose your words carefully. The best thing to say is that it's negotiable compensation that you pay a buyer's agent or buyer broker. You may want to pay them more and encourage them to get paid for negotiating on your behalf because of X, Y, or Z with your property. Your property may need to have more compensation paid to the buyer because the buyer broker will have to contend with that type of issue. So again, you want to really kind of take it off of the typical or the normal or what is required. None of those should be used in your dialogue with a seller or with a buyer. So we've had to go through and look at our training materials to make sure that we do not have anything on there that constitutes that our compensation is not negotiable, either representing a buyer or representing a seller. Okay, so here's another kind of thing that we should go through. A listing agent texts a buyer's agent after a showing and asks if the buyer is interested in the property. The buyer's agent says in a text, this did happen, this has happened also in our firm as well, in the past, and again, this is prior to 2024 with the new law. Since buyer's broker compensation is only 2.5 or X% or 3%, we have decided to scratch this off our list. Thanks and good luck. So that is something that was texted to a listing agent. So the listing agent then says, you could just write it up with a higher compensation, or you could have the buyer kick in a percentage is the predominant listing fee in the area, but there are ways around it if you try. So if you think about what we talked about in the prior slide, where the problems with this is the buyer agent says no offer since comp only was X. It implies that the listing broker should be offering a higher compensation or a predominant listing fee. That's where they went wrong. So it could be seen, it's not inappropriate to have a conversation with the buyer about what they're offering, but what it is inappropriate is the anti-competitive language when it talks about predominant listing fee. That kind of language should not be in the exchange. So what should the buyer agent say when the listing broker asks this question? And was it okay for the listing broker to suggest to the buyer agent to write in the offer, including the increased compensation? I want you to take a moment and just chat or open. I would love to hear some thoughts on this. Do you think it's okay for the listing broker to suggest an increased compensation?
I'd say it's negotiable, just like everything else.
Yep, that would be the way to handle that. Great, Lisa. So yeah, instead of saying the listing agent, you could just write it up with a higher compensation, and we can negotiate the compensation. That would be the way to redo that listing agent text. And the buyer's agent, instead of scratching off the list, you could say, I noticed the buyer's broker's compensation is X. Would your seller be opening to negotiate the compensation paid to the buyer? That is okay. Okay, so the engagement's not the problem. It's what was said in the text message that it's the problem. Okay, so here's another one that we need to discuss too. I mean, these are fees that are disclosed on websites. I would anticipate websites are going to be scrutinized even much more than they already have. I just put this, and I need to put in, my X did not carry over on the slideshow, but I did a big X because I don't want you guys doing what this website did. It says save with Redfin's lower, that this fees subject to change, minimums apply, buyer's agent fee not included, learn more. And there's all these clicking, and again, makes it very confusing for the consumer. So fees disclosed on websites, are they legal? Are they not? That's up to the attorney to determine. If you are doing something like that on your website, you probably want to have your attorney or our attorney review that type of language before you operate in that fashion. But compensation, again, is negotiable. And can you negotiate compensation with a buyer and a seller, somebody who wants to buy and sell? The question that came from our group is, when you have these types of offerings on websites, can we negotiate our commission or our compensation? It's called compensation now. Can we negotiate that, and can we write that into our contract in our buyer service agreement and our listing agreement when we represent a buyer and a seller? And the answer is yes. We can compete, and we can write this type of adjustment of our compensation into our contract, but it has to be in our contract, and it has to be in writing, and the contracts take priority, not the website. The websites could have some potential problems or pitfalls. I'm not saying Redfin's wrong or right. I'm just saying I don't want you guys doing this on your own websites unless you've had it looked at by an attorney, because there is some antitrust potential with some websites that are operating in this type of way. Compensation section, this came from a consumer that was a best choice agent or a best choice client. And this is in reference to section 6 on our buyer agency or our buyer service agreement. So the consumer said a question, this is the question, just curious, of 6% total, 3% for each broker side is still common for our search area. And will we see any pushback from the sellers not willing to pay at least your 3% fee in an off-market situation? I want to try and not be in a position where we must pay top dollar for a property and the seller is not willing to pay a fee. We will make good on it, but hope the sellers will be reasonable. So this is from a consumer that this particular agent may have considered that buyer is maybe not quite ready to sign an exclusive with that particular agent. More relationship should probably be done between this buyer and this broker. But we ended up getting the buyer to sign a buyer service agreement with us. But there was more explanation that was needed in regards to Section 6. They were concerned about the way it was written. And the way, again, if the seller was not willing to pay the buyer service fee, you know, in an off-market situation. So it was a kind of a, but what's interesting about this from the consumer is this section where it talks about common for our search area. So even consumers are trying to get us to fall into the trap of price fixing, or, you know, and so the way to deal with this was some things that we had here. So how do we handle this type of thing or these types of situation? These are some keywords that we use. All websites of homes for sale display buyer compensation offered for each listing. That is a fact. Again, the reason I'm saying that is because you could use that in some of your explanation to buyers that have questions about the buyer service agreement as well. That's a fact. All websites that are listed for sale on websites display buyer compensation. That's a requirement that is required on each listing now. So I could basically make them feel good about that. That for listed properties, that whatever is listed is what could be offered, and that would offset perhaps the percentage that we have in the buyer service agreement. In each contract and in off-market situations, I will go to the seller to negotiate my buyer compensation. That you could say, because that's a fact. In off-market situations, I do go and negotiate with the seller on behalf of the buyer using the buyer service agreement as a tool. In a multiple offer situation, I have a form to negotiate my buyer compensation offered to make it more attractive for the seller. That is also a fact. We do have a form. The form is called a 41C to negotiate buyer compensation that's offered to make it more attractive for a seller. So if that does occur, we have a tool to help us with that. The other fact is I'll advise you on each opportunity what the seller is or is not willing to do. So we will have a choice on how we negotiate my compensation on each purchase and sale agreement that I write. Ultimately, the biggest change in the buyer service agreement and why we're having to put this in place is so that we provide more transparency of how I am compensated. That is what the biggest rub is here. In an off-market situation where I represent you, the buyer, I have never in my career had an issue getting the seller to pay for my professional fee because they are not paying a listing fee. And I can honestly say that. Now, if you've said one, I mean, maybe 2 times where the buyer had to pay, then you say that. But I mean, when you look at how many transactions you've done in your real estate career, they will be very few and far between. So it is a fact in my career in an off-market situation where I represent the buyer, I've never had an issue in getting paid for my professional fee. So hopefully these kind of, this type of terminology will help you in texting or handling questions regarding the compensation section in Section 6. But we still have people that are doing their forms wrong. So let me go through that for you guys too. So I did 2 screenshots. It's a lack of understanding of the compensation and how it relates on the buyer service agreement. The first one I have here, and I know I'm going to go over today, so I apologize ahead of time, is the off-market or buyer service agreement is that 3 and 2.5% only was offered. So in this case, where we have an off-market or there was a buyer service agreement at 3 and only 2.5% was offered, we ended up putting, this is the correct thing to do, but what I have a lot of people doing is they have an off-market or a buyer service agreement and they've indicated this is not filled out. In fact, this box is not checked, or they don't put this amount in. You do have to put a percentage in and then put other, and then use a 41C as the way to explain your compensation. Alternatively, and this is most of the case, when the buyer service agreement is at 3 and you and your client decide not to enforce the 0.5% difference, or the 2.5% matches your buyer service agreement, or the listing displays 2.5%, you're going to put the percentage, put 2.5, and you're going to check the box, pay as offered. I would say half of the purchase and sale agreements that I've reviewed in the last month have not had this box checked. They probably just put the percent and put the 2.5, but they failed to put the checkbox either here or here. Don't run the risk that you're going to have a problem when addenda starts getting introduced, or Form 34 or 41C. This would be a secure way to go ahead and showcase that. So again, that is the way you would want to do this. This also sends a message to our firm. If you ended up having this done, this pay as offered, and not using a 41C, and you did have a buyer service agreement at the 3, and then you ended up going with the 2.5, that sends a message to the firm that we're not going to go after the difference in the 0.5% by you having no other addendum or a 41C introduced. That we're just going to go with the pay as offered, and we're not going to go after the extra 0.5% unless you have an agreement that allows for that. So you'll want to, if you are going to want us to enforce that, you'd want to check the other box, pay as offered, or put in the 3%. Say you were going to go with the 3%, you would check the other box and have a 41C, and that would allow us to collect the extra 0.5%, either from the seller, the buyer, or we, in this case, the way it's written here, we don't collect anything additional. It is just the 2.5. Okay, this is the 41C. So you can see there's plenty of choices here on how we would reduction in the buyer brokerage firm compensation. We are seeing that with multiple offers where they're offering 2.5, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to reduce our compensation so that we can actually get paid. The seller doesn't have to pay as much in compensation. We had a winner from a multiple offer situation that we reviewed that went ahead and checked this box. So again, compensation again is negotiable. But if it's not paid as offered, we do want to see a 41C as on the file there. Other situations with buyer agency that have come up is we've had some VA buyers. And just another recommendation or just a reminder that buyers do not have to pay, but they need to agree to the representation that is still required. Even though you're working with a VA buyer and they do not have to pay the buyer service agreement that's listed, we still have to have that buyer service agreement on file in order for us to be paid any kind of buyer service agreement or any kind of buyer compensation that's been offered by the seller. So we have to have it no matter what. If a VA buyer is struggling with, I don't want to do an exclusive, then we may have to do a non-exclusive, but they do need to have something on file for that representation. 41C is used when the buyer service agreement does not match the compensation. We talked about that earlier. And we have already been using buyer agency for VA buyers even before January 1. Now, new construction, other situations that we've had questions about. New construction buyers, the compensation offered for buyer agency could be substantially less or zero. And in those cases, we have represented over 50, I just checked, new home buyers who opted to pay consultation fees when $0 is offered. So we have had buyers willing to pay us consultation or a retainer or paid us something, and when there was no compensation offered by one of the builders. And you guys probably know the builders out there that offer zero or substantially less. And so you will want to utilize that buyer service agreement and know what it says and know how to explain that to a buyer and how they pay us or pay you. Form 42C is helpful with additional incentives. So some builders offer a substantially less compensation, but they may have, a special for the next 30 days, they're going to pay X amount of dollars towards a buyer, a service agreement. If that is something that will help you, you would introduce a 42C, and that would also have the seller or the builder sign that to authorize you to get paid in that way, or that incentive can be essentially explain to that lender who would be lending on the property. So 42C, we have started to see the need for that to arise in some of the new construction or the new homes. But BCR has more choices on our buyer service agreement than the one that's Northwest MLS published. So we have utilized that. And if you do have a situation where we do need to invoice the buyer, we have a system and a process for that. You can just send an email to accounting@bestchoicerealtywa.com, and we will issue an invoice for that buyer consultation fee or that buyer retainer fee. And we do that all the time with commercial and also with some of the contracts that we operate where there's zero compensation listed. So we've been very successful in that type of process. A lot of people ask me about non-exclusive, and I think introducing a buyer service agreement with an exclusive, or we're going to be exclusive or we're going to be non-exclusive. It's kind of like dating. And I think somebody explained that very well on one of the mastermind classes that I attended. The buyer doesn't know what they've signed. So we have a lot of education to do. So if they've signed something, you want to probably ask them, have you signed an agreement with another agent? If they say yes, then you can ask them, was it exclusive or was it non-exclusive? The buyer I think they think right now, they're really confused that if they hire multiple agents, that maybe they'll find a house more quickly, which I can understand that line of thinking, but honestly, that doesn't usually help. If you, in the dating example, if you sleep around, I don't think that really helps you find the one. And once you start to get exclusive with somebody, then that I think becomes a more of a relationship. And so how do you convince a buyer who has already signed a non-exclusive agreement with another brokerage to sign an exclusive agreement? It's more questioning, it's more support, it's more knowledge, it's more experience, it's more understanding of the forms. It's a tough question to answer on a Zoom meeting that I'm already over time with. But I would say that to answer some of the questions, can we solicit a buyer that has not signed an exclusive? The answer is yes. If it's non-exclusive, they're fair game. Can I get paid if I only have a non-exclusive? The answer is yes. We can pay you if it's a non-exclusive agreement that the buyer would only sign with you. If the buyer has multiple non-exclusives with other brokers, am I doing something wrong if I enter it into an exclusive with the buyer? You're not doing anything wrong. In fact, you're probably doing something very, very right because you've explained it to them. But just be careful that they understand that potentially they could owe 2 commissions or 2 compensations if that exclusive buyer was not the one that actually wrote on it was a non-exclusive, but they ended up writing the offer. There's a potential of, I think it would be very, very far-fetched to think that that would happen, but you never know. I say that, and then next week we have somebody that basically signed an exclusive, and then there was a non-exclusive, and that buyer could potentially owe 2 compensations if they have an exclusive and non-exclusive. Again, we're not the attorneys that would actually litigate that, but that potentially could happen. Default. So what could happen if the buyer, basically, if we happen to default? It would be crazy. This is quote for quote what a buyer has said to us in response to putting a buyer service agreement. If we happen to default, it would be for some crazy reason that may or may not actually be a true default, depending on legal proceedings. So basically, this buyer is trying to really understand, it's over the top in having me sign something. There's a lot of pushback right now that we're getting in regards to signing a buyer broker fee. Why do I have to sign something with you? The other broker does not require this. So again, we need to understand what the default is. So who's really going to enforce the defaults? Listing firms are not going to be the ones that are going to enforce it. So they're not going to be asking for a copy of our buyer service agreement. Will escrow demand the buyer service agreement? Not usually, unless it's an off market, then they may require to have something in writing that outlines for them how they're going to be allocating that buyer service agreement. Hopefully with off market, you're using a 41C that already makes escrow aware of how that's done. But the DOL will audit, and there will be civil lawsuits that could be possible. and potential regulatory discipline, license suspension, and certainly potential for damages, civil damages, Consumer Protection Act. Those are the types of things that we need to contend ourselves with. If for some reason the buyer defaults or we don't follow through and actually put these agreements in front of our buyers. So if role played at open house, this just use common sense, ask if the buyer is working with another agent. If the buyer says that they are not, then ask the follow-up question, if it's not, did they sign a non-exclusive agreement with you? If it's non-exclusive, you can proceed with maybe making an appointment with that buyer to go meet at the office or meet to have coffee or go show some homes, and then make sure you go over the disclosures with them, the pamphlets that we already talked about, and enter into a buyer agency agreement with the buyer. So notice that we don't just put the buyer agency agreement right when somebody walks in the front door. There is a time that is the nurturing time to help that buyer get through it. Off-market sales, I'm going to show next week how to go in and do the BCR Marketing Center and do a prospecting exercise on I have a buyer. I think that's definitely a good strategy right now when inventory is still very challenged. I'm going to go through step 1, 2, 3, and 4 next week. So stay tuned for next week's webinar. We'll be doing that. But I just put on the screen here just so you get a sense. There's not a lot of off-market opportunities. Most of the sales that are happening in our area are listed sales. In West Seattle, there were only 49 in the last year that were reported as off-market sales to the Northwest MLS. And that's the highest that I saw anywhere in any city. So if you really think about it, I know there's off-market sales out there, but they're just not as common. And we need to basically go after that marketplace and find those people that are interested in listing their home or that are interested in maybe not listing their home and saving in the compensation, but they may be interested to know that you have a buyer service agreement and an agreement for a period of, say, 3 or 4 months, where they may be able to save some compensation and save some of the pain on them, save some cost. So we'll go over how to do off-market sales next week, but that's all I had. Let's go ahead and just open it up for questions. Was that helpful? Go ahead and unmute your line.
Yes, very helpful information.
Okay.
So I have a question. If somebody has a listing, and say I have a listing, then so we negotiate with the seller our compensation, and then we also tell them that they can do the percentage for the, we don't just say we do 6%, or can we do 6% or whatever, and then.
Yeah, I always fill my listing agreements out, so there's nothing wrong with doing that. But I do explain, and so I think what your question is, Lisa, is at the point when we're talking about how I get paid, how the compensation, my professional fee for listing your property is here, listed right here. It's broken out. It used to be combined in Washington, right? Remember how we used to have the total compensation and they broke it apart. So now we have 2 different types of scenarios. It's actually 4 different scenarios that are outlined in the listing agreement. And so what we are wanting you guys to do is to explain that here is my compensation for listing your fee, and here is the compensation that I have put in for paying the buyer, the person that brings your buyer. Does that work for you? And most people are like, that works great, Rachelle, that sounds good. But that it does give an opportunity for them to negotiate and say, you know what, I really don't want to pay 3% to the person that brings the buyer. Maybe I want to pay you more, Rachelle, because you're doing a lot of negotiating on behalf of me and my family who's overseas right now and having to do all that. We may have that discussion, and as we do, we would cross off initial that section in the listing contract. What we don't want to get into is like, oh, because this company is offering this compensation and that company is offering that compensation, then we require this. We got to avoid those types of price fixing conversations. So there's nothing wrong with having a conversation about the compensation. And once the seller signs that listing contract, it's fully, explained how it's broken apart. Where it wasn't like that before. I think that's the rub. Did that make sense, Lisa?
Yep.
Okay. Other questions? Mary, did I explain it okay for you?
Sounded good to me.
Okay, Cheryl? Gotta check my veterans, make sure I didn't cross any lines here.
I think I'm
Yes,
really
all
gonna
good. Thank you.
I'm gonna have to
Oh.
really watch myself, I think, just like you did in the beginning. We've done it this way for so long. And so for me, it's repetition. I've been listening to the MLS stuff. I want to listen to you in our Zoom groups, we're talking about it. And I think if we just keep practicing and remind each other, I keep forgetting about compensation.
I know, we keep slipping out the commission, but I think
Right. I know. Old ways die hard, but I'll work on it. I promise. I'll try to keep you out of trouble.
so far so good. We're actually having a really good month. So keep up the good work out there, you guys. And hopefully
Thank you,
this was
Rachelle, for all
helpful,
your
and
support.
you're welcome.
Rachelle, I have a question here.
Go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, I saw the new buyer agency agreement has combined the disclosure receipt. So do we still need that disclosure receipt?
You can use, if you still have our old receipt, that's fine. It's not like, we're just making it a lot easier. If you've already done the buyer service agreements, let me show you here, like if you're already getting the buyer service agreement from here, it already has the disclosure receipt built in. So the real
Yeah,
estate
because it
brokerage,
already has a check mark for that. So the
so you don't need the second
disclosure
receipt.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. So, right, buyer's disclosures, I think we even took it down so you guys don't get confused. So buyer service agreement, Washington, there's the pamphlets right here. We took down the receipt. And then the forms, there's the buyer brokerage service agreements. And if what we're talking about here is the section 9. All of the receipt is just check boxes now. So I would check in my scenario, I check real estate brokerage in Washington pamphlet, mold and moisture, lead-based paint, wire fraud. I'm not going to be working with this buyer only in Renton Highlands. So I'm not going to check the Tacoma side sewer, and I'm not going to select the buyer's disclosure and seller's market, but it's going to be A, B, C, D, and G that I sent him yesterday. So if I now send them the buyer service agreement, I'm going to go ahead and check those boxes. And what's nice, you guys, is I'll also put the 41D in there on number 12. So if you don't have inspectors, your risk, that we're referring disclosure, we're required to do this 41D. It's already embedded in our buyer service agreement. So we're protected there also for inspector referrals, which is very nice. Okay, great question.
Now, I don't know if you saw there's several questions in the chat.
I did not.
Mine was that I'm assuming the buyer's agency agreement is also required if it's a commercial deal.
It is for now. The commercial will have its own. It's probably three to 6 months behind everything else. But yes, please just continue to use the buyer service agreement for your commercial clients when you represent them as buyers. But you'll probably see an adjustment to that come spring or summer.
Thanks.
Mhm.
I have a clarification question
Sure.
with Offmart. I asked a few questions, I think, in the
It's
chat,
the
but
property max.
they were already,
Answered.
already kind of answered as we went.
Okay.
But I do have a question with the new agency law, basically having to be in contract in reasonable time to represent buyers. In the context of off-market, it's my off-market buyer list of buyers who have asked me if I know of an off-market, to ask the seller that if it would be okay to talk with them. And then we're able to utilize the Form 47 for that. So now, would I not be able to utilize any buyers on that list starting now if I do not have a non-exclusive or exclusive buyer agreement with those buyers?
You're basically listing them on the 47 on like
Yeah.
for the buyer. Yeah, you can do that. There's no change in the 47 on how that's done.
So if I don't have a buyer's agency agreement with the buyer on that list, that's still okay to go the off-market route?
Yep. Yep, there's no change to how that's handled
Perfect.
in
That
Washington.
makes my life so much easier. Thank you.
Yes. The biggest thing we're trying to get is just more buyer service agreements in place. And again, we have to be and it hopefully exclusive, right? Non-exclusive. Somebody said, I don't share well with other non-exclusive in the sandbox. That's cute. I didn't say anything wrong. Yeah, okay. I think we got through most of the chat. If I didn't, I apologize. I'm missing my Shannon today. Yeah, that's good. Steven said, script for getting agency agreement signed. Wouldn't it be silly to represent you if I don't actually represent you? Yeah, that's kind of funny. I think we got, and Abby, I answered your question about commercials. So I think we're good on the questions. If there's any other questions, go ahead and unmute. But I'm sure we'll come up with other things as we go forward. So just keep me, just text me if you have questions that you get from your clients, or email me that you don't know how to respond to. If you're worried about saying the wrong thing, I mean, it might be helpful to get a second opinion on it. Because I mean, it's like, whoa, I can't believe I need training on that too. So I've had to take a lot of training just to get my terminology changed on how I look at these types of things to keep us out of trouble. So it's better to, not overreact as well. Keep it really simple. You probably don't want to email or text. Sometimes it might be better just to pick up the phone and have a conversation. Okay, awesome. All right, you guys have a great week. We'll see you next Monday. I'm going to talk about off market and going after some prospecting. And now that I have a buyer service agreement and now I've got an area and there's only like one listing or two listings and it won't work for my client, what are some tools that we can do? And so I'm going to go over how I do that for a client next Monday. So if you're interested in knowing about that, jump on next Monday's call. Have a great week, you guys. Thanks so much.